Okay, how about this? Can you hear me? Okay, thank you, Miss De La Vega. Alright, so I'll present to you my screen. For this meeting class, since last meeting, we've done discussing about maximization, no? Remember, siguro medyo nakalimot na ta, no? Kay dugay-dugay po ta wala nag-meet because of the holidays that is set by the school, no? Pila ba ka-holidays ang ato? Murag isa ra day ka-holiday ang nilabay. But katong last meeting, maximization nato ang gi-discuss. Now, the coverage for our midterm is both maximization and minimization. So, since our midterm, di ba supposedly, nga, karon man no, ang schedule sa midterm, but in our case, wala pa man gud tanahuman sa tong coverage. So, we will have our midterm by next Wednesday. Okay? By next Wednesday, ako ang i-chat ha. Para dili mo malimot, midterm exam Wednesday, that is November 11. Okay. November 11, 2020. Okay, so the coverage is maximization and minimization. So for today, as I've said, minimization na to ang i-discuss. Last meeting, we've discussed about maximization in which we made 5 simplex tableau, no? Before ta nakakome up sa to ang decision. Karon, dili na ta sa minimization. So actually, I'll just be discussing to you the example here in the book, but kanang dili man ka wala naman kay siya problema so the procedures because we will just kanang sa tawag ani kanang ang procedure nato is the same lang gihapon sa maximization pero naalay variance gamay, no? Nana siya kanahan gamay, of course, because lahi man po ni siya, no, minimization. But generally, ang paagi, maura, nalay mga rules nga nabali. Because before, maximization of profit. So we will focus on the quantity ay on the product that gives us the highest profit. Now karon minimization na ta. So walay minimization of profit plus because of course as a business our goal is always to maximize profit. Now, unsa man na to i-minimize? That would be the cost. Now, in the minimization of cost, there will be a new set of rules, but as to the overall procedures, the same lang gihapon. So, more or less, kaning nga problem, medyo gamay-gamay na lang atong buhaton nga simplex tableau because kanang makuha na dayon siya, no? Dili na siguro ni siya moabot og mga 5 pa ka simplex tableau. So it will be much easier for us to answer. Okay, so I've posted na po di ay ha. I've already posted the video katong last 2 meetings, 'di ba? Ang first meeting na post na nako atong miagi pa that was the part 1 of the maximization, dayon ang part 2 kaganihan lang jud nako na post last. Okay, so karon diri na ta sa minimization. So actually naa naman sa book, no? Naa sa book ang mga answers. Pero actually ang naa sa book but daan mo gani siya ang libro class and then murag naadyo mga kuan nga na mali, mga amounts nga na mali. So, much better jud nga ato siyang i-solve. And much better nga, if you can see any discrepancy between the book and my solution, then since na-prove man ni nato ato ang solution nga sakto, kay ato man siyang step by step og buhat, then you follow my solution. Nakakaman niya siyang i-post sa Excel. Okay, so let's start. Minimization of cost. So, just be copying the table sa Picasa. Okay, for the minimization of cost, we are to minimize cost equals 8x1 plus 8x sub 2 plus 0s1 plus 0s sub 2. So, as I've said, di ba? That is minimize. And then we have C equals 8x sub 1 plus 2x sub 2. Okay? So, di ba, as I've said before, ingani ra na usually ang kanang given, no? Ingani lang ang given. Wala pa siya kaning slack variable og artificial variable, no? Kay kaning problem diri sa book murag gi-present naman gud jud niya kung unsa ang answer, so it will be hard for us to identify, no, kung sa unahon kung mag-base lang ta sa book. Kay ang book gi-present na niya ta ng answer, so para mas masabtan nato, that's why we're going to make this step by step. Okay, so initially mao pa ni ang ihatag nga formula, no? This is our objective function, which is to minimize cost, equals 8x sub 1 plus 2x sub 2. Unsay pasabot ani? So class, we have two products, si x sub 1 and si x sub 2. For x sub 1, x sub 1 contributes a cost of 8 pesos. So that's why 8 pesos multiplied by x sub 1. So the x sub 1 represents the number of units of product 1. For the second one, we have 2x sub 2. This means that the product 2 gives us a cost of 2 pesos per unit. So that is why 2x sub 2 represents 2 pesos multiplied by the number of units of product 2. And this is our objective function. So dapat when we sum up the total cost of product 1 and product 2, dapat it would give us the minimum cost. Now, how do we do that? Let us first look at the constraints, no? Unsa may mga constraints ani? Of course, if there are no constraints, then we can easily pwede ra maskin pag unsa kana as long as pinakagamay jud nga cost mo ang ato ang gamiton kung pwede lang, but of course dili na siya mao ang reality because bahala pag unsa pa nato gusto kapag gamayon ang cost, there will always be constraints, there will always be limitations. So that's why our objective function is to minimize the cost subject to the following constraints. What are these constraints? First, we have 2x sub 1 plus x sub 2 is greater than or equal to 20. Okay, search sa akong symbol ha. Is greater than or equal to 20. That is our first constraint. What happened here? Dali lang ha. Okay. 20. Next, second constraint, we have x sub 1 plus 2x sub 2 is less than or equal to 25. Okay? Search na po ko og symbol to get the less than. Okay. So, less than or equal to 25. Ganun dako man kayo niyo eh. Lago siya ko aning Excel class ay. We have 25. Next. Okay, and then we go to the last constraint. So actually, class tulura ni ha, unsa man ning last? Diba remember that there is an implicit constraint. So tulura ato ang constraint ani. So we have the third constraint that is x sub 1 plus 5x sub 2 equals 50. Okay, kanon sa book, namali na siya. So i-consider na yung red, no? Ang gibutang man gud sa book, ang gi-encode is greater than or equal to, pero dapat equal sign jud na siya. Okay? Dapat equal sign na siya. And then, that is all for our constraints. So, class, if you remember, previously, di ba we talked about the big four? No? Na big four is because upat po ato ang constraints. But, this time, dili na ta big 4. Kay tulo man atong constraints, then big 3 na lang ta. Okay? Big 3 na lang ta. But, dili na siya napasabot nga kay kung maximization dapat upat, kung minimization dapat tulo. Nagdepende ra jud na siya sa number of constraints. Pwede nga na ay 5 ihatag, na ay 6, na ay 4, na ay 3 depende sa problem. Okay? Now next, So that is our constraints. Then let's proceed to the implicit constraints. So of course, as you can see, natay duha ka variable, di ba? Because naman tay duha ka product, si product x1 and si product x2. Now, unsa man ang ato ang implicit constraints ani nila? Now, since product x1 and product x2 represents number of units, and so x sub 1 and x sub 2 must also be greater than or equal to 0. Because remember about the non-negativity assumption in which our answers must not be in the negative. Okay, dapat positive jud sila. 0 or 0 and above. Because we're talking about units here. Okay, now for the new program of constraints. So I hope you can still remember that under the new program of constraints, we are to follow certain rules. So, unsa man nga rules? Kato na siyang naa diri sa book. So, we have here, previously, diri ta nag-focus sa maximization problem. Because of course, maximization problem na ito ang topic. Karon, minimization problem. So, we will use the second rule or the rule for minimization problem. Okay. Now, let's start with this first symbol nga naa diri sa constraints. The first symbol that is given is the greater than or equal to, which is the third one here. So, for the greater than or equal to, if the symbol is greater than or equal to, then subtract surplus variable s, but add artificial variable on the left side and change the sign to equal sign. Okay, so di ba kapehon man to, 2x sub 1 plus x sub 2. Unsa dato yung una buhaton? Subtract surplus variable. Take note that the surplus variable is represented by the letter s. Okay, now for its number, we will add 1 because that is S sub 1. Okay? S sub 1. So, subtract surplus variable but add artificial variable. So, minus S sub 1 and then plus A sub 1. So, A sub 1 is the artificial variable, or artificial variable is represented by the variable A. And then change the sign to equal sign and then copy 20. Okay, so this is now our new program of constraints. Next, for the second constraint, we use the less than or equal to. So that is the first one here in the rule. So we will follow the first rule. If the symbol is less than or equal to, then add slack variable to the left-hand side and change the sign to equal sign. So dali ra, no? Igo ra ka mag-add og slack variable. So how do we do that? X sub 1 plus 2x sub 2 and then just add the slack variable. Now, of course, since ikaduha naman yung slack variable, then you put the number 2. That is S sub 2. And then change the sign to equal sign and then 25. And then for the third one, since equal sign man na siya daan, so if the symbol is equal sign, then add artificial variable A to the left-hand side and retain the equal sign. So we just have to add the an artificial variable. So that is x sub 1 x sub 1 plus 5x sub 2. Oh, what happened? X sub 1 plus 5x sub 2 and then add artificial variable, so plus a sub 2. Nganong 2 man ang a? It's because ikaduha pa man ni siya nga artificial variable. And then retain the equal sign and then copy 50. So this is now our new program of constraints. Now, of course, for the implicit constraints, madungagan po ni siya because aside from the x sub 1 and x sub 2, nanapod tayo additional slack and artificial variable. So we have S sub 1, natay S sub 1, natay S sub 2, natay A sub 1, ug natay A sub 2. Okay, so igo lang nato gidungagan ang variables because under the new program of constraints, nadungagan man po ang ato ang variables. Now, let us go back to our objective function. Now, since our variables were added, so dungagan pud nato ang ato ang objective function. So since nadungagan mo na og S sub 1, S sub 2, A sub 1, and A sub 2, then we will also add that here in our objective function. So let's start with plus S sub 1. Okay? S sub 1 represents the slack variable. Now, take note class, remember, di ba, pag slack variable, that is a surplus. So, remember also that slack variable will always have zero cost. Okay, if you can still remember, under the maximization, zero ang profit ni slack. And also under the minimization, zero gihapon ang profit ni slack. Okay, so we have S sub 1 and also we have S sub 2. Now again, slack variable man na, surplus man na, so zero ang iyahang cost. Then we will add the artificial variable. So we have two artificial variables, artificial variable 1 or A sub 1 and A sub 2. Now take note class that under the rule, the artificial variable is the most costly or the variable that will give us the highest cost. And the rule for that is that the artificial variable will have a cost of 10. Okay? It will have a cost of 10. So we have 10 A sub 1 and then also for the second artificial variable, so you simply add 10, so 10 A sub 2. Okay, so hanagikan fixed na na siya. Alright? Fixed na na siya nga 10. For the slack, fixed na na siya nga 0. For the artificial variable, fixed na na siya nga 10. Okay, and that would be our objective function. Now, let us go back to our table. So, we may now start setting our initial simplex tableau. So, let me just copy this one here. Gamay dyan siya class I. So, ako lang i-change ang CJ. So, class, instead nga PJ before, that was the profit, di ba? That's why P sub J. Karon, CJ na. Ang mga P, ilisa na tog C. So, just like this one here, from P sub J, change to C sub J. Then, this one also here, from P sub J, we will change it to C sub J. Okay, and I'm going to delete this one first. Kaya kato maning daan good nga. Formula ako, ay daan nga table ako ang gigamit. Okay, wait lang for a moment ha. Kadali lang ha. Okay, so this is now our initial simplex tableau. So to start with, of course, kopyahon nato kung unsa ang nasa new program of constraints. Okay, so as I've said, class, since tulura man naka-constraint, then we only have here the big three. Okay, the big three. Now let us first copy the variables. So as you can see, di ba, naman tayo variables nga, x sub 1, x sub 2, s1, s2, a sub 1, and a sub 2. Wait lang, las ha. Okay, so we simply copy that, x sub 1, x sub 2, s sub 1, s sub 2, a sub 1, and a sub 2. Okay, now next is to put the cost. No? Hagay na to makita ang cost, di ba? Mao man ni siya. Each variable has their respective cost nga makita na to sa to ang objective function. For x sub 1 has a cost of 8, x sub 2, 2, slack variable 1, 0, slack variable 2, 2, a sub 1, 10, and a sub 1, 10 also. Okay? Now, next is for the big three. For the big three class, since, di ba, minimization man ta, if you can still remember, under our maximization, giunsa gyud nato pagpili ang big three ato, since maximization man, dapat, in the end, makuha na to ang pinaka dako nga profit. So, to start, magsugod jud ta sa pinakagamay nga profit para ang ato ang simplex tableau magkadako ang profit nga i-contribute. While diri sa minimization, since minimization of cost man, dapat in the end pinakagamay nga cost ato ang makuha. So that is why what are we going to choose here is the ones that will give the highest cost, no? So, ang nasa initial simplex tableau katusang pinaka highest nga cost. Then later on, magkagamay siya until we will reach our optimum table that will give us the minimum cost. So, unsa man ang mga pinakamahal nga variable ani. Basihan na to na siya based sa ato ang per constraint. So di ba natay tulo ka constraints, that's why tulo ang ato ang rows diri. So let's start first with the first constraint. Under the first constraint natay variables nga x sub 1, x sub 2, s sub 1 and a sub 1. So unsa may pinakamahal dire, di ba? Ang pinakamahal man jud is the artificial variable. Now, that is the nature of the artificial variable. So, for the first constraint, we will choose the artificial variable. Okay? Artificial variable. Next, for the second constraint. Okay. For the second constraint class, what are we going to use here is the surplus variable. Okay? You choose the surplus variable. So, S sub 2. And then for the third one, of course, we will choose the A sub 2. So, for the big three, we have A sub 1, S sub 2, and A sub 2. Okay? Next, for the quantity, hagay na makuha ang quantity kaning naasa after sa equal sign. We have 20, 25, and 50. 20, 25, and 50. Okay? Next is for the value of each variable. Okay, for the first constraint, we have 2x sub 1. So we will put here 2. Then we have x sub 2. Then that is 1. For the negative s sub 1, that is negative 1. There are no s sub 2 here, so we will put 0. Okay? And then a sub 1, that is 1. Or that has a constant of 1. And then, for the first constraint, wala man tay a sub 2, so we will put there 0. Okay, remember ha, kung wala kay makita dira nga variable nga naa diri, then you just simply put 0. Next, for the second constraint. For the second constraint, we have x sub 1. So, x sub 1 is a constant of 1. For the 2x sub 2, that is 2. There are no s sub 1, so we put there 0. And then we have s sub 2, so that is 1. There are no artificial variables in the second constraint, so these are all zeros. Next, for the third constraint, we have x sub 1, so this is 1. 5x sub 2, so that is 5. S sub 1, walay S sub 1, so we put there 0. Wala ako'y S sub 2, you put there 0. Now there is no A sub 2, so you put there 0, but, there is no A sub 1, so you put there 0, and then naay A sub 2, you put there 1. Okay, so diba, pareho lang sa maximization.
Excuse me,
Ah,
ma'am.
yes.
Ma'am, pwede mag-ask.
Ah, sige, sige.
Ma'am, nga nung source ka ng sub to ang gigamit sa second product, ma'am, nga nung siya ang kuan nga katong big three, di ba ma'am, dili man
Ah,
maka-generate og profit. And then sa big three, ma'am, kailangan man nga ang
ah,
highest para
yes.
mag-maximize siya.
Okay,
Unsay
sige.
rationale behind, ma'am?
Wait lang ha, kadali sa. Mm, wait, because I am going to check it first ha. Kadali lang. Ay, wait sa class ha, kay libog mo kaning book oy na may mga namaliog ko kadali lang. Okay, so for the S sub 2 in the second constraint, so the actually the general rule for this one is we are going to choose, 'di ba? Because as I've said, minimization, so magsugo jud siya sa pinakadako taman sa maabot ta sa minimum sa pinakagamay. But there's a rule here that is written in the book that we are going to start with aside sa kanang aside sa i-consider nato ang pinaka-highest, then we are also going to start with the positive slack and the artificial variables of each constraints in the initial simplex tableau. So I'm going to show you ha. This is done by entering na dire oh. So the kaninga paragraph, this is done by entering the positive slack and artificial variables or each constraints in the initial simplex tableau. Okay? So, regardless, bali murag ang kuan bitaw niya kay generally that is the rule that we are going to start with the highest. But kumbaga there is a specific rule also nga we are going to start with the artificial or the slack variable. So murag kumbaga ang ato ang pilian ani na ang ato ang pilian sa so good is the artificial and the slack. And between the artificial and the slack, then you choose the highest of them all. Okay? So just like this one here in the first, although, let's say for example, let's say kaning x sub 1, what if this is kuan? What if this is 15? 'Di ba? What if this is 15, 'di ba? If you remember, ang A sub 1, 10 man na siya, no? So, in that case, ang A sub 1 lang gihapon ato ang ibutang. Okay? Because accordingly, we are to start entering with the positive slack and the artificial variables. Okay? So, you choose between the slack and artificial variable, and whichever is the highest among them all. Okay, so for the first one, that's why we use the artificial. For the second, we use the slack. And then for the third one, we use the artificial. Okay, that is the rule for the minimization. Okay, so you just simply follow it. Ha? Mag-choose lang ta sa artificial and slack variable. So if there is slack, then if there is artificial, then you use the artificial. So if there is slack, then wala artificial, then you use the slack variable. Okay? So that is written there. Whereas for a simplex minimization tableau, it is proper to start a simplex table with very large total cost along the zero, so that as we develop this initial and subsequent tables, the zeros will demonstrate a decreasing value for the total cost until we obtain an optimum table that shows the minimum cost of the objective function. This is done by entering the positive slack and artificial variables of each constraints in the initial simplex tableau. Okay, so we will follow the general rule, highest, and then we will also follow the specific rule that mustarta sa slack or artificial. So between the slack and artificial, since artificial will always give us the highest cost, then if there is slack and artificial, you use the artificial. If there is slack but there is no artificial, then you use the slack variable. Okay, so actually, as to really the specific kuan jud bitaw kung anong mo start jud sa slack, honestly, wala ko kabalo. Wala ko kabalo sa unsay rationale ani nga kuan kanang kani ang pilion ang slack variable. Okay, so follow na lang ta sa process nga or sa rules nga gibutang pod sa book. Okay, so just remember you start either with the slack or the artificial variable. Okay, so let us then proceed to the next. Alright, so maglibog na lang jud ko aning book class bitaw no kay kanang naamo gyud mga correction but butog sakto baka ning gipang butang nga correction. But let us answer this one as is ato ang gisugdan dire. Okay? So where are we? So this is now our initial simplex tableau. Na-plot na nato ang mga values nga naa sa ato ang constraints, no? The values that came from our implicit constraints. The next one that we will do is, di ba, i-compute na to ang total cost, which is the ZJ. Now, for the ZJ, saan ito, di ba? Katong cost diri multiplied by the quantity. The next is cost diri multiplied by x sub 1, then cost diri multiplied by x sub 2. Okay, but before that, ibutang sa nato ang mga cost per product. So, as you can see here, for the cost per product, for the A sub 1 and A sub 2, we have 10. And for the S sub 2, we have 0. So, we will put here 10, 0, and 10. Okay, 10, 0, and 10. The next is to compute. So, to compute, remember sum product. So that would be the sum product of this one here multiplied by this one here. Okay? And then we will get 700. Okay? I'm going to put dollar sign sa to ang formula para pwede na to ma-drag. Okay? We can drag it until the last one. Alright, so unsa ito'y formula ani? Again, 20 times 10 plus 0 times 25 plus 10 times 50. Also here, under sa x sub 1, 10 times 2 plus 0 times 1 plus 10 times 1 equals 30. And then here, 10 times 1 plus 0 times 2 plus 10 times 5, and we will get 60. And then you follow the same procedure until the last column. Now, next step is to compute for the CJ minus ZJ. So, hagay itong CJ, kaninga column. Ang ZJ, kaninga column. So, we deduct. So, kung maka-remember mo class, pero horadyo ang ato ang gibuhat sa maximization. Pero, of course, nalang dyan ni siya variance gamay. Okay, so, we can get 22 as our difference. The next, 2 minus 60, we can get negative 58. Okay, then we can drag this one until the last column. Okay. Now, next step is, di ba, mamili ta diri, under the maximization, ang ato ang gipili ato before is the one that will give us the highest profit. Okay, di ba? Positive highest profit. So dapat dito sa maximization naay mga positive. So kung napay mga positive, we will continue in making succeeding table. Pero kung negative na tanan, then that is the time nga mo stop na ta. And whatever is written here will already be our decision. But unlike diri sa minimization, pabaliktad ang ato ang buhaton. If in the profit maximization, ato ang gipangita is the highest positive, diri ang ato ang pangitaon is the least one. Unsa ang pinaka gamay. Okay? So ato ang lantawon diri sa rule ha para maklaro. Okay. Determine the entering variable of the optimum column in the column with the highest positive entry. Encircle the optimum column. For minimization, choose the column with the most negative entry. Okay? Most negative entry of ZJ minus CJ minus ZJ. So among this, ahaman ang naay most negative entry, of course, naratay duha ka kumbaga nominees, natay duha ka pilianan because there are only 2 negative, and then the most negative there is the 58. So we will choose the 58 as we will choose this one under the negative 58, which is the x sub 2. We will choose that one as our entering variable. Sige, pasabot anang entering variable. Kumbaga, si x sub 2 musulod na siya dire sa to ang big 3. Okay, sa big 3 na to nga product. Si x sub 2, musulod na siya dire. But the question there is, kung musulod si x sub 2, kinsa naman pod ang mugawa. So that is the time nga, pangitaon na sad nato ang pivot row. Okay, how do we compute for the pivot row? That would be the quantity divided by the optimum column. So, may quantity dire kaning 20 and then divided by the number in the optimum column. So 20 divided by 1. So we can get 20. Next, you just simply drag. We have 25 divided by 2. Okay, this is 2 there. 25 divided by 2, that is 12.5. And 50 divided by 5, that is 10. Okay, so same sa maximization, what are we going to choose here is the one that will give us the least amount. Okay, the one that will give us the least amount or least positive quotient. Step 7, determine the outgoing variable of the pivot row or the row with the least positive quotient between quantity column entries and optimum column entries. So we disregard if the answer is 24 divided by 0, which is a math error, 3/4 or 0 over 5. Okay? So, we choose 10 as our least positive quotient, and so therefore, this means that since this is our pivot row, so kinsa ang mugawas? Kinsa ang outgoing variable? The outgoing variable is a sub 2. So again, musulod si x sub 2, mugawas si a sub 2. And then by that, we are now going to make our new table. Okay, so i-copy gihapon nako ang lang ha. Okay, so let's start with our new pivot row. So for our new pivot row, we are going to compute that by pivot row divided by the pivot element. Okay, this one here, the pivot rows divided by the pivot element. But before that, i-copy sa nato no ang ato ang mga variables. So we have there x sub 1, x sub 2, s sub 1, s sub 2, a sub 1, and a sub 2. Now, for our pivot row, we start with the quantity 50, and then we have 1, then we have 5, then we have 0, 0, another 0, and 1. Okay? That is 1. Now, this one, never mind. Okay, that is for our pivot row. Now, the next step there is to divide it by, ay, namali day class. I'm sorry. Let's do it again. Start with the quantity, ay, sorry. Quantity, dili na siya dapat. Okay, dili na siya dapat sa babaw. And then, we divide it by the pivot element. So, unsa gito yung pivot element? The one that is within the intersection. Now, since ang nasa intersection is 5, then divide everything by the pivot element. Okay, we divide it by 5. Okay, so next step is to divide it by 5. So 50 divided by 5, 1 divided by 5, and so on. Okay, so this is now our new pivot row. So for our initial second simplex tableau, mao na ni siya ang mupuli sa row 3. Okay? Kanina ang mupuli sa row 3. Now let us compute for our remaining rows. For our remaining rows, duha na lang 'di ba? Since na naman tay bag-o nga row 3 which is katong gi-compute nato, then ato na ding next i-compute is si row 1 and si row 2. So let's start first with the new row 1. So same lang gihapon class, the old row 1 plus the negative element of the amount in the what do we call this? Negative element sa naa diri sa optimum column. So for example, for row 1, ang nasa optimum column man is si 1, 'di ba? So we will use negative 1. Okay? And the negative 1 multiplied by the new pivot row. So how do we do that? So yung ani. Okay, so we have the old row 1. Copy the old row 1 starting from the quantity 20, then 2, 1, negative 1, 0, 1, and the last one we have 0. Okay, next is to add that one by the new pivot row multiplied by the negative element in the number in the optimum column. So we have the new pivot row, which is the 10 there, and then multiplied by negative 1. And next, point 2 multiplied by negative 1, and then so on. Then after that, we will add both the 2, we will add the old row 1 and this one to get the new row 1. Okay, so we have 10 and so on. Okay, so next is to compute for the new row 2. For the new row 2, so same lang gihapon, old row 2 plus the amount in the optimum column multiplied by the new pivot row. Now, since the amount in the optimum column is the number 2, so we will multiply this one by the negative 2. Okay? So, same procedure gihapon sa atong gibuhat sa first one. Lang ha. Copy the old row 2. So, starting from 25, and then we have 1, 2, ups. 1, 2, 0, 1, and 0. And then we have another 0 sa pinakalas. And then after that is negative 2 multiplied by the new pivot row. So new pivot row of 10 multiplied by negative 2. So we have negative 20.2 times negative 2, that is negative 0.4, and so on. The next is to add the 2. So we have 5.60 and so on. Okay, that is for our new remaining rows. The next one is to make again the second simplex tableau. Okay, ito lang sa i-copy to make the second simplex tableau. For the second simplex tableau, okay, second simplex tableau, so ato asa ni ipang delete ning uban. Hay kalisod ba ni? Delete sa, delete, delete. Okay. Okay, so this is now our second simplex tableau. Then we simply copy kung unsa ato ang na-compute. So let's start with the first one. So for the row 1 class, wala man na-change ato ang product, that is still product A sub 1. Okay, for our quantity, we will copy the one that we have computed until the last column. Okay, next is for the row 2, wala na change, that is still S sub 2. Okay, that is still S sub 2. Then, for our values starting from 5.6 and so on. This is the new row 2. And then lastly, for the new row 3 class, since si A sub 2, outgoing variable naman ni siya, pulihan na siya ni X sub 2. So, we have here X sub 2. Then, copy the new pivot row. And then you drag until the last column. Okay, now next is let us identify their cost. For A sub 1, of course, that is 10. S sub 2, that is 0. Well, for X sub 2, that is 2. Okay, next step is the sum product of this one here and then this one here. Okay, kani multiplied by na diri and then you add their products. Then after that, Same procedure para sa next nga columns. So in my case, ako na lang i-drag ha. Ako na lang i-drag. Okay, so how did we do this? Same lagi hapon ha. The amount here multiplied by the amount here and then add their products. The amount here multiply the amount here and then add their products. Okay, then after that, you get the ZJ minus CJ minus ZJ. So to compute, we have 8 minus 18.4. We have 2 minus 2, that is 0. And then you drag until the last column. Okay, for those who are using the kanang calculators or sa papel lang, no, wala nag-Excel, then you compute it using your calculators manually. Okay, so yeah, actually, kung face-to-face ni siya, manual, jud mo tanan. But karon, if ever na mo'y kuan laptop, i-allow lang ta mo nga mo gamit og laptop. Okay, or mogamit og Excel. The next one is, sige to'y pilion na to, we will find the least most negative entry. Now, in the CJ minus DJ, naraman tayo isa ka negative entry, which is 10.4. So, this will now be our optimum column. Okay, this is now our optimum column. Okay, now, after that, sa optimum column, pangitaon na to ang pivot row. To compute for the pivot row, again, quantity divided by the optimum column. So, we have 10 divided by 1.8 and then so on. Okay, and sige, ito yung next, Ani. We will search for the least positive quotient. Least positive quotient is the 5.556. So, this will now serve as our pivot row. So, sa napod gani mahitabo ani, si A sub 1 mo gawas na pod siya, pulihan siya ni X sub 1. And then by that, makakompute na dayon ta or makabuhat na dayon ta sa to ang third simplex tableau. By the way, na may klase sa 9. Na may klase class sa 9. Because if wala, ako na lang continue until the third. Kay last naman ang third simplex tableau. Hello? Wala ra? Sige, magpadayon ta ha. Pero this is until the third simplex tableau lang. Okay, paspaso na lang nato ang ato ang formula. Ay, atong formula, ato ang solution. Okay. Okay, so for the new pivot row, that is the pivot row divided by the pivot element. Of course, the pivot row there is the first column. Okay, that is the pivot row. So, I will copy the first column and then the next step is to divide it by the pivot element. So by this time, unsa atong pivot element, di ba? Kana si 1.8. So we will put there 1.8 divided by 1.8. So divide each one by 1.8. 10 divided by 1.8, we have 5.556. 1.8 divided by 1.8, we have 1. 0 divided by 1.8, we have 0, and so on. Okay? So that would be our new pivot row. For the remaining rows, ang remaining rows na to is row 2 and row 3. So let's start first with row 2. For row 2, the formula is old row 2 plus the pivot, the amount in the optimum column multiplied by the new pivot row. So may amount sa optimum column, di ba? We have 0.6. So this is now negative 0.6. Okay? So for the old row 2, we have there 5, and then 0.6, and then 0, 0, 1, 0, and negative 0.4. We add that one by the new pivot row multiplied by negative 0.6. Okay? So we have 5.55 times negative 0.6, 1 times negative 0.6, 0 times negative 0.6, and so on. Okay? Next is to add the both. Then we now have our new row 2. Okay, and then lastly, for the new row 3, We have the old row 3 multiplied by the amount in the optimum column. Since the amount in the optimum column is 0.2, so our amount here should be negative 0.2. Take note ha, the negative element of the amount in the optimum column. So, row 3, we have starting from 10, old row 3, and then new pivot row multiplied by negative zero point 0.2. Okay, negative zero point 0.2. And then, you drag. Okay, so when I say drag, meaning same lang ang formula until the last column. So we now have our new row 3. So we can now proceed to our third simplex tableau. So actually, this is the last tableau. Okay, we have the third simplex tableau. Okay, so before that, ako sang i-erase ning mga naana po diri. Okay, so for the third simplex tableau, let's start first for the new pivot row, that is row 1. So we copy from 5.556 until here. Okay, so for the first one class, this is row 1. Remember that the outgoing product is A sub 1 while the entering product is X sub 1. So we will put here for the product X sub 1. Okay? Then next is for the row 2. For the row 2, same lang gihapon. Gihapon sa S sub 2. So we put there S sub 2. And then we copy the amount that we come up. And then the third one is, that is still X sub 2. So the third product is X sub 2 and then copy the one that we have computed in the row 3. And then you drag. Okay? After that, compute for the cost. But before that, i-identify sa nato ang cost. For X sub 1, we have 8. S sub 2, that is 0. And X sub 3, this is X sub 2. For X sub 2, we have 2. And then compute for the total cost by computing the sum product. So we have the amount here multiplied by the amounts here. And then do the same for the rest of the column. Okay, so how did we do this one? Same lang gihapon hagi. Multiply lang. And the next is we compute for the CJ minus ZJ. So we have 8 minus 8. And then we have 2 minus 2. Okay, and then so on. Okay. So class, unsa gito ang pangitaon diri, we are going to search for the most negative entry. Now since by this time wala naman tayo nakita nga negative, so kung nga na na case dili na ka makapadayon, so that means that this is already our optimum table. Meaning in this table, this is where we will get our decision. Okay, this is where we will get our decision. So unsa man ato ang decision ani? Our decision is, since diba, our product is X sub 1 and X sub 2. So, unsa to akong giingon? Kung unsay na-address sa big 3 mo, na ato ang decision. But take note nga, kani si si S sub 2, this is a surplus variable. So therefore, kana siya, pa-char-char na siya dira, no, for computation purposes. But for our decision, we are only to consider our ordinary variables. And our ordinary variables there is X sub 1 and X sub 2. So what is our decision? Our decision is to produce, for X sub 1, to produce 5.56 units. And for X sub 2, to produce 8.89 units. Now, using this decision, pila man ang cost nga ato ang makuha. Now, with this decision, we will get a cost of 62.22. And this 62.22 is already the minimum cost. If you look at the previous table, for the initial simplex tableau, the cost is 700. For the second simplex tableau, the cost is 120. But for the third simplex tableau, the cost is 62.22. And this is now the minimum cost. Therefore, to produce X sub 1, 5.56 units, and X sub 2, 8.89 units, that will already be our decision. Okay? So class, take note, si surplus variable, wala na siya ma-contribute nga cost. So therefore, sa pag-compute aning 62.22, wala gihapon na appeal ang surplus variable dira. Okay, so this will now be our decision. So class, I will send to you the activities for this topic, maximization and minimization, to be submitted next week. And then by next week, we will already have our midterm exam. What is the coverage? Both maximization and minimization. You're going to compute one problem for maximization and one problem for minimization. So ako ang ihatag sa inyo ha, aside from the questions or from the given, ako apod tamong tagaan og format. Okay, so kumbaga, inig-answer ninyo, inyohan na lang i-plot-plot diri sa mga table. Okay? Ang format lang. Pero of course, ang formula, kamo jud ang bahala na. Tagaan lang tamo og kanang murag blank nga table. Okay? Blank nga table. Okay, so are there any questions? Hello, are you still there? Do you have your next class? Wala na ipangutana? Sure mo? Sure? Okay, so midterm exam ha, next meeting, and please, kuan ha ang inyuhang permit, secure your permit. Okay, so I'll just be uploading this one again sa inyuhang Google Classroom. Okay, sure, if you have questions, then you may just message me. Okay, dayon ko anha kanang if ever man go dili ko maka-online sa kaning isa na ko ka account, kanang you just chat in the group chat nga nag-PM mo, no? Para ma-open nako ang teacher's account. Okay, so chat mo daan sa group chat nga nag-PM mo para ma-notify ko. Kay dili ko ma-notify og PMs manggod sa PCAS account. Okay, so that will be all for today, class. Just wait na lang for the posting of this video. Kay maghulat pa pod ko sa Google ani nga mo message sila sa ako ang ready na ang record ani nga meeting. Okay, thank you for your time, class. And then have a good day. Goodbye, everyone.
Bye, ma'am.